Hi everybody. Normally in an in-person class I talk about the APA paper quite a bit, so that's why we're starting to get quite the little pileup of my recorded lectures on how to accomplish this task. You really have, today is Thursday when I'm going to post this lecture, and so technically you have a week to get this done. So I'm going to show you my best advice for how to make sure you're on track getting organized and wrapping up this paper in time to submit it on Wednesday. First step is to watch this. Hopefully you've already watched how to find articles and you've found a bunch of articles. I've assigned you to find 4 just as part of your other tasks. So hopefully you've been reading like a mad person and finding lots of articles that you can tie together. I've shown you how to take notes from the articles. So here's where we left off. We've got this pile of notes. Okay. For me, this can kind of be a little bit of overwhelming when I've read all these different articles. There's so many things swimming around. But you guys don't really have time to let it simmer and wait for insight. You have to get it going. So what I like to do to get myself going is to go ahead and start a little outline. And I'll come back and delete the outline later once I've started to fill it in and I've started working. But sometimes I don't even bother actually using outlines. I'll make kind of little headers that I plan on deleting later. So for example, based on my reading in the literature, so far what I've noticed is that there are a couple of themes that I would want to address in my intro, and I'm not sure what the order is. So based on my notes, as I told you guys before, there are things like intention to learn is one issue, what tasks they were performing is another issue, how long the delay was another issue, what kind of memory test they used was another issue. So I'm just going to write those things down. So I'll go intent to learn. I'll go, that's like one basic topic, right? So then I'll say tasks performed on words. That's another big thing to talk about. Another thing to talk about is the delay before memory test. And then another thing to talk about is type of memory test. Okay, so based on just having done my reading, gotten my 10 articles together, these are the 4 big themes that sort of kind of came up. Now, how did I find that? Well, part of how I found that is from what I told you in my last video on this topic. I took these little note cards and I sorted them into piles based on similar topics. And I ended up with 4 basic piles. And these are the topics that emerge from those 4 basic piles. Okay, so just having gone through my cards, making them into piles and sort of characterizing what each pile is about takes a little bit of cognitive effort. So for me, because I can sit there and I can shuffle through those cards trying to figure out. One time when I was going through my cards on another paper I was working on, I had been reading and reading and reading. I'd probably read like 20 articles, and it just seemed like everybody was all over the page on this topic. I could not really figure out one coherent theme that would allow me to sort of leap off and start talking about what I wanted to talk about. And so I was sorting and resorting and piling and repiling, and I was on the floor in the living room and the dog kept walking on it and all sorts of stuff. And my poor innocent husband comes walking through the room and he goes, "What are you doing on the floor over there?" And I said, "Well, I'm sorting my topics into piles." And he said, "Well, what's your topic?" Oh, that was his mistake. He shouldn't have acted interested, right? Because then I said, "I don't know what my topic is." And I said, "These are the things that people have found." And I start telling him what I'm reading off the cards. And he said, "I don't know what you're talking." I said, "Don't interrupt me." I just kept unloading out loud what was on the cards. And I kept trying to characterize it in a way that I thought he'd understand what I was talking about, maybe make it interesting. By the time I got done spending 5 minutes talking to him, I go, "Okay, go away, I figured it out." And I figured out my piles. So what is the moral of that story? Sometimes it's in your best interest to find someone just to bounce it off. what is the coherence that I'm seeing among all these different all these different studies that I've been reading. Okay, so now once I've set up my topics, again, I'm not sure if this is the order I would ultimately want it to be in, but what I can start to do is just sort of insert in here, well, what do I know about intent to learn? And I oftentimes don't use full sentences and prose passages while I'm doing this part. I oftentimes will just go ahead and change my indent so that this stuff will all be underneath. I can drag it so that this will all be indented to make it really clear that I'm just free floating here. I'm just free associating, and I'm writing the stuff that's coming off the cards sort of as it is, as it lies. I don't put a lot of organization on it first. And then once I get it all into the computer, then I start reading it over, reading it and thinking it and phrasing it and trying to fix it. And then I start copying and pasting things and moving it to other spots. And maybe I'll decide that the flow would be better if I talked about task before I talked about intention. Maybe, right? I mean, I can move it around once I've got it going on. The last thing that I will tell you that is I'm sorry, I lied. 2 things I'm going to tell you that are critical to doing well on this paper. I can absolutely tell the difference between papers that were written using this piece of advice and papers that were not. The first step is for when you think it's getting pretty decently good, is to print a rough draft and you read it and fix anything that looks awkward. When you're reading it on this page, on this computer page, it can get you can miss a lot of flow problems, redundancies, things that you said on page 3 don't seem all that glaringly repeated when it comes back up on page 5, but if I'm reading it straight through, I'm going to notice it. Things like that. So literally you have got to print a hard copy and sit there with a pen or a pencil and add things in, take things out, move things around, like draw circles around stuff and say, this needs to go up here to make it make more sense. I need to add more stuff in. And then the second thing that is absolutely critical, so you need to make a hard copy and you need to read it. Then once it's gotten as good as you can make it, right? You've worked on it as hard as you can. You're like, it looks good to me. Now print one more copy and give it to somebody who you trust their reading ability. Somebody who you know can read well. They don't have to understand psychological concepts. That's not the issue. My husband tries to stay as deliberately ignorant of psychology as he can because he doesn't want to necessarily have a bunch of conversations about psychology all the time. But he can read and he can tell me whether my paper is not making any sense, whether it's got a glaring omission. Sometimes he'll pick up typos because I'll leave words out, and when I was reading it with my own eyes, I filled that word in my mind and I didn't even realize it was missing a whole word. I had a sentence that it wasn't complete because I left a word out. So those 2 things, print it and you go over it and fix it up, notice the typos, get everything all straightened out, and then fix those things in the computer, print another hard copy. Don't make your friend or your loved one read your written on bad looking, no. Print them a nice clean copy and ask them to read it for readability and understandability. And you will do so much better on this paper than if you just try and type in your computer and send me what you've created on your computer. I do not want your first draft. I will know when it's your first draft. I have students who will say, well, mine was basically my first draft. Yeah, I don't believe them. If they got an A on the paper, I doubt it. My guess is every single student who has ever gotten an A on one of my papers has gone through this rough draft process. Have someone else read it, especially if English is not your first language in particular. Have someone else read it. If you have English as your first language, have someone else read it. I have someone read my papers today. I still make people read my papers. So you are not different. You need people to read your papers. Okay, so just a little reminder about APA issues. Every single thing in this literature review needs to be supported by a citation. If you're talking about someone else's research, you need to give them credit. So the simplest way to do that is to give them credit first thing when you cite what they've said. Let me give you an example from this annotation. So I gave you an annotation sample, an annotated sample. And I made comments all along inside the paper, and this will help you to see what kinds of things I look for and the kinds of things that I say about papers. The first thing is that I wanted you to notice that I'm talking about is this here. Everything is cited in this literature review. Every single idea or thought has a citation. As soon as the idea comes up, cite the source. You do not have to, okay, let's say, just for fun, most studies use the scenarios developed by Kowalski 1993. In Kowalski's scenarios, the participant determines a scale of 1 to 10, how clearly the actor, blah, blah. You'll notice there's no more citations of Kowalski throughout here. That's correct. Once you've established that I'm talking about Kowalski and Kowalski's scenarios, this whole paragraph, I, as the reader, will assume is still coming from Kowalski until I either encounter a new citation within this same paragraph. All of a sudden you start talking about somebody else, or a new paragraph starts. If a new paragraph starts and you're still talking about Kowalski, you need to recite Kowalski there. Every new paragraph I'm going to assume came from somewhere else. Now look at this. Kowalski 1993, Divers et al. 1997, and then we see the Kowalski citation again here. Because Divers came in the middle, this stuff needs to be cited as coming from Kowalski, otherwise the reader might conclude that it's coming from Divers. So that's what I'm talking about. You need to cite every single thing that you say and make it really clear which source, which ideas came from. In your job in your literature review is to bring together the literature. Your job is to put your voice on it. I want to hear your voice. I don't want to hear sciencey science guy voice. I want to hear your voice. So I've had students who have cheated on this paper, and when they got busted, they said, well, I couldn't write as well as the original source, so I just used their words. And I don't expect you to sound as good as a professional author who's been writing papers for decades. I expect you to sound like a student who's writing their first literature review. Maybe if you're lucky, you've had English 201. I'm not expecting you to sound like a professional writer. I'm expecting you to sound like a student who is doing the best they can to use proper grammar and follow APA style. That's what I'm expecting. So do not resort to copying. Do your best to impose your voice across the paper. If you read this annotated example, you can hear the author's voice coming through all the stuff that the author's reporting. Here's another example where it starts off with a Kowalski citation. Here comes Divers in the middle again, and then here's another Kowalski citation, so we had to go back and use Kowalski's name again. And then we get to another citation, Fisher and Walter. So you can see that this is how you cite. There's citations all throughout. And so everything in this paper needs to be supported by something from the literature. Okay. So hopefully these step-by-step ideas for how to go from a basic idea to maybe getting a little bit more concrete, to starting to fill it out, to doing a rough draft and you fixing it yourself, to then printing another rough draft and getting a person to read it for you, to finally giving me what should be your third version, and should hopefully be an A paper because you fulfilled the goals of 10 research reports brought together into a 5-page literature review, double-spaced, conforming to APA style. I'm going to show you one more link just to remind you that before you submit, you may want to go ahead and review the rubric to make sure that you are fulfilling all of the things that I'm going to be looking for in the rubric. So you'll notice you're going to be graded on APA format. I'm going to be looking at the accuracy of your references on the reference page, and then also how you're citing those references in the body of the paper. I'm going to look for the clarity of your topic in the literature review, the logic of your presentation, that would be like the order, is it making sense, and then the clarity of your presentation of other people's findings, other people's designs, and then finally there's just sort of this overall, how readable was this paper? Did I really have to struggle to understand what you were saying, or was it very simple and easy for me to make sense of what you were trying to convey? So Good luck. I think you guys can do it. Hopefully you've already been working on it, but if not, it's time to get started. All right, good luck.